A warm welcome to all our listeners and viewers to this conversation on COVID-19 and the Christian faith. I'm your host, Nathanael Somanathan, lecturer at CTS Colombo Theological Seminary. Joining us for this conversation are our guests, Dr. Ajith Fernando and Dr. Mano Emmanuel. Dr. Ajith is the teaching director of Youth for Christ in Sri Lanka after serving as the ministry's national director for 35 years. He's the author of 18 books published in 24 languages and has a worldwide ministry. So thank you, Dr. Ajith, for joining us. And we also have Dr. Mano, who is the former academic dean at CTS and currently functions as the head of academic advancement at CTS. So thank you, Dr. Mano, also for joining us. And so we will go directly into our topic today of discussion. As you might know already, this is a four-part series. Last week, we talked about judgment and the book of Revelation. And today, we are going to deal with hope and lament. In this difficult and seemingly never-ending crisis, hope is a rare commodity. Christianity either seems to favor triumphalism, that is acting like everything will be just fine anytime now, or defeatism, embracing despair and just cruising through. Therefore, we will talk about another way today, maybe a middle way, namely about the Christian hope and lament. I think for us as Christians, we do talk about hope, but we also talk about specific hope. We talk about the Christian hope. And so I want to ask you both, what is the Christian hope and how must Christians hope in these situations?
Well, I think for a Christian, perhaps one of the great passages on hope and circumstances is Romans chapter 8. In Romans 8, we are given a specific understanding of what is hope. Hope is it comes out of the belief that in all things God is working for good, verse 28. And what that good is, we don't know. But that good includes frustration. Frustration is a given in life. That comes a little earlier in that passage, maybe verse 20 or so. So for us, hope comes out of the belief that God is in control. He is sovereign over history, and He's working out. But the way He works out is not necessarily the way we think things should work out. He's working for the good. In fact, in that passage, we see that the good that Paul talks about in Romans 8:28 is being conformed to the image of His Son. In other words, we become more holy. We become more like Him. And that is the greatest good that could happen.
I was thinking the Heidelberg Catechism asks this question: what is your greatest hope in life and death? Mm-hmm. And the answer, my greatest hope in life and death is that I belong to God in life and death. And I think building on what Dr. Ajith said, the sovereignty of God, but not a sovereignty that is distant from us, but that we belong to God. And I think that relationship is also what gives us hope, that we belong to God not just through creation in an objective kind of distant way, but that we belong to God through redemption. We see the character of God, and I think our hope is in that character, the sovereignty and also the love and the suffering through which we were purchased to belong to God. So our hope, I think, is in His character and in His purposes, the fact that there is a purpose and an end that we are certain of.
Right. And just to continue on this same idea of hope, and we've as you've already mentioned, the character of God and trusting His sovereignty and trusting what He's doing. There's also, lends itself to understanding that Christ is directing creation and is directing this story towards a magnificent end. Um, the end that will be actually a beginning for us in the new life, in the new creation. And so talking about the resurrection hope is also, I think, appropriate here. How do we understand hope in the now, but also hope in death? And what are we expecting as Christians when we die, or if we die? Even in this crisis, death is not partial. Everyone is going to face death. But what is the Christian hope amidst of that is something we can talk about.
Yeah, well, I think a Christian constantly lives with the hope of the resurrection. Paul in Romans 8 says, in this hope you were saved.
Yes.
So hope is very much a part of our gospel. I think we do wrong when we don't bring in the hope of eternal life and of heaven, when we present the gospel without that. So I think because of that, it shapes our values all the time. In fact, I like to say that every day we think about heaven. Every day we realize that that's our final goal. And what is right and what is wrong on earth is to some extent determined by that. That doesn't mean that we are going to give in to injustice and all of that, because God is a God of justice. And our mission here is to be salt and light. And we work for justice, but always remember that our final reward is in heaven. And that gives us courage to pay the price of whatever has to be paid here on earth.
I think, like Dr. Ajith said, this constant awareness that that there is something better in store. And I think perhaps we have too often made that hope, the life after resurrection, very ethereal and not very exciting and not very real. And so we have tended to put all our hope in this life and this life is good. I mean, there's so much beauty and love and work and all these things that we enjoy and worship.
Yeah.
And we often put resurrection hope and resurrection life as something somehow less than we have here. But if we understand it the way the book of Revelation explains it, the way Paul talks about, to live is Christ and to die is gain, then we would look forward to what God has and think of it as something, it can't be less than what we have here. It has to be better. It has to be more beautiful, more rich, more rewarding, more relational, everything better. But we generally tend to think of it as somehow losing out.
Right.
And I think that's why it's difficult for us to have that hope.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I think this crisis has revealed to us, as beautiful and as great as some of our experiences might be on this earth, that this earth and its contents are fragile and transient in many ways. And there is this longing within us for something more and better, and that is the longing for eternity itself. And I think that's what God is preparing us, and as Christians, we are called to announce that hope, that hope that is available to all. Now, there is another important part, and when we talk about hope, it's not to, like you said, it's easy for Christians who are comfortable and who have the luxury of staying indoors and having the money and the provisions and security to even stay as long as they need to stay indoors till this pandemic passes over. It is a luxury for a lot of Christians, but there seems to be a tradition within the Christian church that has come to the aid for those who have not been so privileged in times of suffering and trouble, which is lament. It is the possibility to come to God and be truthful and honest about the struggle, the struggle with unbelief, the struggle with the pain of loss, the struggle with confusion and doubts and things like that. So hope on the one hand is good, and it's there and we must hold to it. So lament is what I'm referring to here, seems to be an important aspect of the Christian tradition, where in the meanwhile, as we wait for this resurrection hope, as we wait for God to do what he promised he will do, that there is this amazing, incredible thing called lament, where we commune with God in a sense. So if we can unpack this a little bit and talk about lament and New Testament Christianity. Are Christians allowed to complain to God? What do you think?
I think they are allowed to complain, as many of the Psalms in the Old Testament give us examples. And of course, we know that there was a lament on the lips of Jesus when he was on the cross. Why have you forsaken me? But I think this complaint that we talk about is with a particular attitude, and that's why God accepts it and allows it and encourages it. It's not the complaint, the grumbling that we see in the Old Testament Israel, which I see as a kind of suspicion about God. I compared it to how we might complain about our internet provider or our supermarket, where we have no particular relationship and we are slightly suspicious, and we are basically saying, if you don't fulfill our requirements, we're going somewhere else. But laments arise out of a committed relationship, and I compare it more like a child going to a parent and saying, I didn't expect this of you. Why are you doing this? Where are you when I need you? Because we already know what that parent is like. And so I think in that context, God encourages us to come as we are, because we are holistic people, and our emotions and our physical pain and our spiritual life are all bound up together. And lament allows God a space to act, so that we don't bottle up these feelings and we don't, go out and attack somebody or try and kill ourselves. But we take it to God, and it gives God a space to work in us. So I think in that sense, God encourages it. It's honest prayer.
I've seen the equivalent of lament. Of course, lament is very common in the Old Testament. 1/3, some people think as much as half of the Psalms are laments. You get a little of this lament in the New Testament also. When Stephen died, a great lamentation arose on behalf of him. And of course, as Mano mentioned, we have the Jesus lamenting from the cross. And then before that, there was the lament over Jerusalem. But I think the theological way in which the New Testament puts this is with the theme of groaning. Groaning is given to us in Romans 8, where we are told that the whole world has been given to frustration, and then the creation groans as in the pains of childbirth, and then we who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we also groan. So here it's groaning as in the pains of childbirth. It is a groaning that is tinged with hope. But because there is this hope, we are unafraid to express the depths of our question, of our disillusionment, of our struggle. My God, why have you allowed this to happen to me? I had a friend who was an Old Testament scholar who liked to distinguish between a groaning and a complaint, a lament and a complaint. And he said that the Christian lament is more of a complaint, because we believe in God we expect God to act in a certain way, and He's not. But it's different to what Mano said, grumbling, because it's the complaint of an obedient person. Here's a person who has been obedient, but for us, this groaning is tinged with hope. It is groaning as in the pains of childbirth. We know that God is working something for good, and that, but ultimately, we will see that. But at the moment, it is very, very difficult to bear. So we are given the permission to cry out to God.
So recently, I think even Dr. Ajith, you responded to a particular question on the passage of Psalms 91, where many people were questioning, is Psalms 91 an appropriate passage to go to during this time? And it made me wonder, do people feel like there's only these two options? Either, you disbelieve in God, or you believe in God so much so that you have to have this view of yourself as invincible if you are a believer in Christ, that nothing can harm you, nothing can hurt you. So maybe Dr. Ajith, maybe unpacking that a little bit, how do we read the Psalms of Lament, and then there is Psalms like Psalms 91?
Yeah, actually, Psalm 91 tells us a truth that is always true. That is, God is with us. He sent His angels to help us. But the way in which He helps us may differ according to the way God wants to bring glory to His name. For example, there was, He says, He sends His angels so that we won't dash our foot against the ground. Now, when I think in my article I referred to Jim Elliot and the way they died, and how when they were being killed, the Indians who were killing him saw some people in the clouds singing a song, but that didn't stop them from killing him. But later, when Jim Elliot's wife and Nate Saint's sister came and spent years ministering to them, these tribal people heard the same songs they heard the angels singing. And they found that these people were singing the same songs. And that was one of the things that helped them to respond to the gospel. So, in one case, the angels may help us prevent death. Other cases, the angels use the death to bring greater glory, which is the conversion of a whole tribe who later became evangelists for the gospel and went to other tribes. So I think the Holy Spirit can work in different ways with us.
I was thinking how those are the verses that Satan used in the temptations to tell Jesus to choose a different path. And he recognized them as being quoted out of context and refused to submit to that. And I was thinking in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Peter takes out his sword to cut off the servant's ear, Jesus says, "Don't you know that I could call on my Father and He would send legions of angels to help me?" And I wondered whether that was so much a part of his decision from the beginning. Yes, those angels are there, but that's not the way right now. And so I think, like Dr. Ajith said, God sometimes miraculously saves people, and any crisis you read about, you will have marvelous testimonies of how people were supernaturally saved, and yet there will be others who were not. And I think our attitude should be more like the Jim Elliot or the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who said, "Our God can, but even if He does not."
The New Testament asks us to follow Christ's example. And there were over 20 references that I found. The vast majority of them was to follow Him in suffering. In other words, to be like Jesus is to suffer. That's the witness of the New Testament. So I think we have to take that into account when we think of the promises also of God.
Yeah.
One of them is that we are going to be like Christ, and by suffering, we are going to bring honor to his name.
Right. And I think that's an important part of what we wanted to discuss here too, along with lament. Lament is produced in suffering. It is the Christian expression that comes out when you are baptized, in a sense, in suffering. And the Bible doesn't talk about suffering in a sense of just God is over there and you suffer here for a while. But Paul talks about the fellowship of his suffering, a sense in which God meets us. And in Micah we see, it says, when I sit in darkness, God comes and comes as light to me. And so can you talk a little bit about that and talk about and I know, Dr. Ajith, you have written a lot about suffering and why that is not antithetical to the Christian life. If you can talk a little bit about, in this crisis, how can Christians view suffering and even through lament and hope still keep moving forward towards what God has for us?
You're talking about what Christians can do, and I think it's linked to this idea that lament is not, it's not a hopelessness. It's lament, like Dr. Ajith said, because we recognize the dissonance between what we expect of the consummated kingdom and what we see now. And yet, because of that expectation, even in lament, we are moved to act. And I think we don't lament as those without hope, but that hope, as someone has said, the hope of the future is like a goad. It's like a spur to make us act in the present.
Right.
And even if you look in history, they talk about the, what we call the Negro spirituals and the slaves who sang those songs. And they were laments, and there was this hope of heaven, and yet they were not passive. They worked towards emancipation. They helped each other escape. They had they took action as well. And
Right.
so I think in the midst of lament, we are also looking to work in the direction of the kingdom. So bringing hope to people, bringing physical relief to people, praying. So I think this waiting is a very active waiting. Even the lamenting is a very active lamenting.
Some of the laments in the Old Testament were not pleasant. These people were struggling, and in their struggling, they were struggling. They were really wondering why is God allowing this? And I think that's why I like to compare lament with groaning. When you're in pain, you groan. And the beautiful thing is that God understands our groaning. And to me, one of the most significant verses in the whole Bible is Romans 8:26. It says the Spirit helps us. That word helps, sun anti lambanomai. It's a long word. It means he comes and takes share in us. He comes and becomes part of us, helps us in our weakness because we don't know how to pray. There's a hopelessness there. And then it says, the Spirit groans with us, with groanings that cannot be uttered. So earlier Paul said that we groan. Now we are told that God groans with us. In the extremity of our helplessness, God comes, and there is a fellowship of suffering with God in the midst of this pain, where God himself is groaning with us. Anybody who feels ashamed of groaning can take heart that even God groans when we groan. So I think there is something beautifully comforting about that there is a fellowship of in our bitterness, I mean the bitter in the sense of a bitter pill we are taking, God comes and shares, and he joins us in the groaning that we groan.
Question for us that we can end this session with is, how can we practice lament in a practical way in our own personal lives and even in our church lives? I mean, I know we can't gather together anymore, but in these days, and like you said, Dr. Ajith, there's no shame in that. So how do we practice it in a Christian way and not slip into grumbling and all sorts of other things, but but tap into this great Christian tradition that we have?
Well, I think one thing to remember, at the moment we are in a very unusual situation because we are not in community, but a lot of lament takes place in community.
Right.
And there is something special about the people of God yearningly presenting their pain to God. So, for example, after the tsunami, when I preached at our church, we all of us got everyone to leave their seats and come to the pews, to the aisles, and to try and remain, to kneel down in pain as an expression of their pain. And somebody tried, well, in this case, I was the one who was praying. I tried to express the pain of our people to God and help them join with our nation in the suffering at this time. We are hurting, Lord. Why has this happened to us? Lord, please have mercy on us. Please comfort these people. We did the same thing after the Sunday after the Easter bombs. We had services in homes. We couldn't have them in church. So I took 2 services for our church in 2 homes. And as part of the service, we had a lament, a time where we can express what we feel to ourselves and to God. So I think lament is an expression of our inner feelings. And it is a part of our yearning. Christianity is a religion of yearning. And this yearning is expressed in the words that we say.
I was doing some research on the kinds of lament songs that have been written recently. And it seems like not only are there very few modern lament songs, but even in hymns, it's quite rare to find hymns of lament. So it seems to be like a long tradition in which the church is not used to formal lament. And I wonder whether some of the things that we could do would be to perhaps encourage people to write. I know in counseling, when you are going through grief and suffering, counselors will often tell you to write your own lament as a help to you to get to work through your grief. So maybe one thing we could do is to encourage people to write for themselves and also for the church. And I suppose it takes courage for leaders. So Dr. Ajith did it in his church, but sometimes I think people fear that if they do such a thing, it's seen as a lack of faith, and that we are opting for the lament when we should be locating ourselves in a different part of the story. And I think we try to locate ourselves in the end part of the story too soon. We're not locating ourselves in the part where we are in the not yet. So I think it's going to take time, but I suppose if leaders show that this is possible. And also I think sometimes we are not used to thinking about each other in worship. And so if we are happy, we don't want people to lament. And we don't identify with those around us. And I think it's Eugene Peterson who talks about liturgy as being courtesy. And that when we are participating in liturgical worship, we are we are forced to be polite to one another. We learn to listen to one another and to sing about things that we may not feel. And I think maybe that aspect also is important to think about, that as a community, it's not only about how I feel, but how the world is feeling, how the country is feeling, how my brothers and sisters in another part of the country are feeling. So this identification with the pain of others and the boldness or the courage to say we are in this part of the story and not that, I think would help us.